This didn't start with a crisis. I think that surprises people when I tell them, because most stories like this get told as though there was one unmistakable moment where everything cracked open, and mine really wasn't like that. It started on an ordinary day, doing something completely unremarkable, when a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't quite shake afterward, no matter how hard I tried to talk myself out of taking it seriously. I've come to believe that the quiet, undramatic moments are usually where the real turning points actually happen, not the big cinematic ones we tend to picture when we imagine our lives. I'd genuinely like to know if any part of this sounded like your own life, because I read every comment on these, even the ones that come in months after a video first goes up. And I've had some of the most meaningful exchanges of my week come out of a comment someone left at some odd hour half asleep, saying some version of, "This is exactly where I am right now." If that's you, don't hesitate to say so below. There's no judgment here, and honestly, hearing from you helps me know these stories are actually doing something useful out there in the world, not just accumulating views. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, because I'd hate for you to miss whatever comes next. Changing. The big moments make for better stories later, sure, but by the time they arrive, the actual decision has usually already been made somewhere quieter, weeks or months earlier, in a moment nobody was watching, including, half the time, the person it was happening to. That's roughly how it went for me. The thought that crossed my mind that ordinary day wasn't especially profound on its own. It was just a small, honest observation about the shape my life had taken, the kind of thing that's easy to notice and just as easy to immediately push back down, because acknowledging it fully would mean admitting something needed to change, and change, at my stage of life, felt like an enormous, almost frightening proposition. So I pushed it down, the way I imagine most people do the first several times a thought like that surfaces, but it kept coming back, a little louder and a little harder to ignore each time, the way true things tend to do when you keep trying to talk over them instead of actually listening. I want to walk you through what happened after that ordinary day, because I think the value in a story like this isn't really in the dramatic ending, it's in showing that you don't need a crisis to justify changing your life. You just need to be honest enough with yourself for long enough to actually hear the quiet thought that keeps returning. That's the part nobody tells you, that the permission to change doesn't have to come from something falling apart. It can just come from paying attention. If any of this sounds familiar, I hope you'll stay with me for the rest of it. And if you want to hear more stories built the same way, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more where this came from. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in a doctor's waiting room, and there's a pamphlet on the chair beside you, one of those full-color folded things with a photograph of a sunset on the front and a phone number at the bottom, and the pamphlet is for a senior living community about 12 miles from your house, and you didn't pick it up off a rack. Your daughter slipped it into your jacket pocket while she thought you were looking out the window, and you found it when you reached for your keys. And you sit there with that pamphlet in your hand, and you think about whether you are genuinely the kind of man who ends up in a place like that. And then the awful, quiet answer comes back, that maybe you are now, because you're not entirely sure what kind of man you still are, without the woman who spent 43 years helping you figure that out. That was me, 14 months ago, at 71 years old, in a waiting room in Tucson, Arizona, holding a pamphlet my daughter had put there out of love, and the love made it worse, not better, because she was right to worry, and I knew it. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and if you're the type of person who finds their way to stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there are more of them coming, and I think you'll want to be here when they do. I was born and raised in Scottsdale, spent most of my adult life in Arizona, moved to Tucson with my wife Loretta in 1994 when she got a position at the university there, and stayed because Tucson turned out to be exactly the right size for the life we were building. Not so big you disappeared into it, not so small you ran out of it. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer, most of them with a mid-sized firm that did municipal infrastructure work, road drainage, water systems, the kind of work that makes cities function and never once gets photographed for anyone's magazine cover. Loretta was a professor of English literature, which meant that for most of our marriage I was surrounded by more books than any one house reasonably needs, and more opinions about 19th century novels than I ever expected to hold my own on at a dinner party. We had one daughter, Ellen, who lives in Phoenix now with her husband and our 2 grandchildren, a son named Marcus, who was 11 at the time I'm talking about, and a daughter named Bea, who was 8. Loretta died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. 14 months that I have divided in my own memory into the before we knew part and the after we knew part, and both halves are painful in entirely different ways. The before we knew part is painful because you can see, looking back, all the moments where something was already wrong and neither of us knew to stop and pay attention to it properly. The after we knew part is painful for reasons I don't imagine require explanation to anyone who has ever sat in an oncologist's office with someone they love and heard a doctor be as kind as possible about information that is fundamentally unkind. She died on a Thursday in March, and I drove home from the hospice facility in weather so ordinary it struck me as nearly offensive. Clear sky, moderate temperature, the kind of day that has no business being beautiful when the world has just reorganized itself permanently around an absence. I pulled into the driveway of the house we'd lived in together for over 20 years, and I turned off the engine, and I sat there while the car ticked and cooled, and I remember thinking, very specifically, not about grief in any large sense, but about whether there was anything in the refrigerator worth eating for dinner, because the mind, apparently, will find you something manageable to think about, even when everything else is unmanageable. The refrigerator, as it turned out, had very little worth eating, because we'd stopped doing real grocery shopping about 2 months before that, once the hospice team had become the center of our daily routine, and I stood in my kitchen at 6 in the evening the night my wife died, and ate a handful of crackers standing at the counter, because sitting at the table alone wasn't something I was ready to perform yet. I want to describe the months that followed with some precision, because I think people who haven't lived through that particular kind of grief sometimes imagine it as a single overwhelming wave, something dramatic that rolls in and then recedes. It isn't. It's a series of very ordinary mornings where you wake up and the first few seconds are fine, and then you remember, and then you have to decide what to do with the rest of the day, knowing what you know. I got up, I made coffee, I watched the news, because the sound of other voices in a quiet house is its own kind of medicine, imperfect but real. I drove to the grocery store and bought too little because I'd been shopping for 2 for over 4 decades and hadn't recalibrated yet, and I came home and put the few things away and stood in the kitchen wondering whether eating was something I was going to bother doing properly today or just something I was going to get through. There's a version of grief that looks fine from the outside. I was in very good health. I kept the house clean. I returned phone calls within a reasonable time. I went to Ellen's for dinner when she asked and held my granddaughter on my lap and watched Marcus try to explain whatever video game had captured his attention that week. And I was genuinely glad to be there. Genuinely, not performing gladness. But I drove home from those visits alone, and the quiet of the house came back every single time with the same force it had the first night, and I understood, somewhere around month 6 or 7, that the house wasn't going to start feeling like mine again just because I kept living in it. It had been ours for 22 years, and ours is not a thing that becomes mine on its own just because the other half of the equation is no longer present. The house just kept being ours, with only one of us in it, and that distinction was making me smaller in ways I didn't know how to stop. Ellen called most days, early afternoon usually, always cheerful in a careful way, a specific tone of cheer that I recognized immediately as the tone of someone who has practiced being upbeat for the sake of someone they're worried about. She asked good questions, real ones, not just polite ones, and I gave her honest answers when the honest answers were manageable, and slightly softened ones when they weren't. She drove up from Phoenix one Saturday, about 8 months after Loretta died, and sat with me in the living room for most of the afternoon, and eventually she said, in the careful way she has, "Dad, I think maybe it's time to start thinking about what the next chapter looks like. Not rushing anything, just thinking." And she'd brought options, not printed brochures this time, links she'd bookmarked on her phone to 3 or 4 retirement communities in the Tucson area and one in Phoenix near her, all of them photographed from flattering angles, all of them featuring dining rooms and activity rooms and outdoor spaces where the residents in the photographs looked like they were genuinely enjoying themselves. I looked at all of them. I nodded in the right places. I told her I appreciated her doing the research. And then I let several weeks go by without following up on any of it. Not because I was being stubborn exactly, but because none of those options had made anything in me respond. They all seemed like places designed to contain a life rather than expand one, and expansion was what I needed, even though I couldn't have articulated that clearly at the time. I just knew that moving from one quiet house into a slightly larger building full of other quiet houses didn't feel like a solution to anything real. What changed things, the way things often change in life, wasn't a plan. It was a conversation that nobody intended to be life-altering when it started. My neighbor for the past 11 years, a man named Gus who'd worked most of his life as an airline mechanic and whose retirement project had been building an increasingly elaborate workshop in his garage, came over one Sunday morning, the way he often did, just to sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about nothing in particular, the way men who've been neighbors for long enough sometimes do without ever quite becoming close friends. Gus was in his mid-60s, still worked part-time as a consultant, and had a habit of bringing up things he'd read or watched in the same offhand way he'd bring up the weather, not starting a conversation so much as tossing something into the air and seeing whether it went anywhere. That morning, he told me he'd been watching videos online about Americans who'd retired to Southeast Asia, the Philippines specifically. He'd stumbled into it the same way most people stumble into things online, one thing leading to another at midnight, and he'd ended up, apparently, 3 hours deep into first-hand accounts from retirees living in various parts of the country, talking about cost of living and climate and the visa program, and, more than anything else, talking about the experience of being in a place where people genuinely acknowledging your existence. I told him it sounded interesting. I said it the way you say something sounds interesting when you are not yet interested, but are too polite to say so. I poured us both more coffee and we talked about something else, and Gus went back to his workshop and I went back to my Saturday, and I didn't think about the Philippines again for at least 2 weeks. But it came back. That's the thing about the right information at the right moment in a person's life. It doesn't always take hold immediately. Sometimes it just settles somewhere in the back of your thinking and sits there quietly, getting more real, until one day you notice that you've stopped treating it like a curiosity and started treating it like a possibility. I started reading. That's always been my way of deciding anything important. I read the way I used to approach engineering problems, systematically, looking for the actual data underneath whatever the surface impression was. I read about the Philippine Retirement Authority and the Special Resident Retirees Visa, which allowed qualifying retirees to live in the Philippines essentially indefinitely. I read about cost of living, which turned out to be dramatically lower than Arizona by almost any measure I could find. I read about healthcare, because that was going to be the first real objection and I knew it, and I wanted to understand the reality of it, rather than just operate on assumption. I read through forum after forum, hundreds of posts from Americans and Canadians and Australians and British retirees who'd made the move and were describing it in the specific, practical terms I needed, not the promotional language of a travel article, but the actual, unvarnished day-to-day of having transplanted yourself to a country you didn't grow up in, at a point in your life when transplanting yourself is not the easy or obvious choice. I still think about that loss every single day, and I want to say clearly that the changes I've made in my life since then haven't dulled that, not even slightly, and honestly I don't think anything ever fully will, nor do I particularly want it to. Forgetting the ache would mean forgetting everything that came before it too, all the good years along with the hard ending, and I'm not interested in that trade, not even for the relief it might offer on the harder days. But I've come to understand something I didn't expect to learn, which is that grief and moving forward aren't actually opposites the way I quietly assumed they were for a long stretch of that first difficult year. I used to think that building a new life, finding new purpose, letting myself feel genuinely good again, would somehow be a betrayal, a kind of quiet erasure of what came before. It isn't. I can miss someone every single morning and still have somewhere to be by a reasonable hour. I can carry an ache that never fully closes and still have things, real things, pulling me toward tomorrow instead of just away from yesterday. Nobody told me that was possible, that those two things could sit side by side instead of cancelling each other out, and I wish someone had, because it would have saved me a fair amount of unnecessary guilt in those early months. Guilt over allowing myself small moments of genuine happiness, as though happiness were somehow a betrayal of what I'd lost. It isn't. I've come to believe it's closer to the opposite, that carrying someone's memory well means continuing to live in a way that would have made them glad to see, not folding yourself down into permanent stillness out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to the grief itself. Choice. I read until 2 and 3 in the morning some nights, which wasn't hard since I was barely sleeping well anyway, and there was something almost therapeutic about insomnia that had somewhere to go, a screen full of information to work through, rather than just the ceiling and whatever thoughts it had decided to project onto it that particular night. The picture that assembled itself from all that reading was specific enough that I could hold it clearly in my mind. A country in the Pacific, with a population that was broadly English-speaking, a legacy of American influence that stretched back more than a century, and had left a cultural familiarity that made the place less foreign to American sensibilities than other parts of Asia. A retirement visa program specifically designed to make the logistics manageable, a cost of living that meant my retirement income, which was perfectly adequate in theory and somewhat strained in practice against Tucson's rising costs, would stretch in ways it hadn't in years. And scattered throughout that reading were individual stories, person after person, many of them widowed, many of them in their late 60s and 70s, describing something I hadn't seen in Ellen's bookmarked retirement communities, a life that had gotten larger after the move rather than smaller. I mentioned to Ellen that I was doing some reading, just reading, about living abroad. I said it casually, the way you mention something when you're gauging the temperature of a room before committing to an opinion. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the careful, loving firmness that is very much her personality, that she had some concerns about that, specifically about me living somewhere far from family, far from the healthcare system I knew, far from anyone who could get to me quickly if something went wrong. These were legitimate concerns. I didn't dismiss any of them. I just told her I was still reading and hadn't made any decisions. That was not entirely true. Something in me had already made a quiet, preliminary decision and was now engaged in the work of making sure it was the right one. I found a name through the forums, a man named Gary, a retired schoolteacher from Oregon who'd been living in a city called Dumaguete on the southern island of Negros for 6 years, who had a reputation in those online communities for giving genuinely honest answers to people who were seriously considering the move. I sent him a message expecting nothing, or expecting the kind of vague, enthusiastic encouragement that people sometimes offer strangers because it costs nothing and sounds generous. What I got back was a 2-page email that addressed, in specific practical terms, every concern I'd raised and several I hadn't thought to yet, including the healthcare question, which he answered not by dismissing it, but by walking me through exactly what he'd done, what insurance he carried, which hospitals in his city were capable of handling what, and how he'd negotiated the reality that serious emergency medicine, the real frontier cases, would require either Manila or medical evacuation. He didn't sugarcoat. He also didn't catastrophize. He told me the actual situation, which was complicated and manageable, and that distinction mattered enormously to someone like me, who had spent 32 years in a profession where the distance between complicated and manageable was exactly what you were paid to understand. I called Gary, actually called him on a video call, about 10 days after that first email. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He told me about his life in Dumaguete, which is a university city, quieter than Cebu or Manila, known for a certain educated, literary atmosphere that he'd found unexpectedly suited to him as a former English teacher. He told me about the people he'd met, the friends he'd made, the ways the city's rhythms had reshaped his days in a direction he hadn't anticipated when he made the move. He told me about his wife of 31 years, who died of a heart attack 4 years before he left Oregon, and the 2 years in their old house afterward that he described as the longest 2 years of his life, not dramatically, not self-pityingly, just as a plain fact of what they had been. He told me, in terms I recognized because I was living inside them, about the particular exhaustion of inhabiting a grief that the structure of your daily life had been rebuilt to accommodate, before you even noticed it happening. The way you stop making certain meals because you only ever made them for 2, the way you stop watching certain shows because they were hers, the way the house gets cleaned and maintained and lived in, and it's all perfectly adequate, and none of it is actually living. Then he said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "The house knows too much about who you were. Sometimes you need a place that doesn't know anything about you yet, so you can introduce yourself on your own terms." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The house knows too much about who you were. Our house in Tucson was 22 years of Loretta, so specifically, so thoroughly, that I couldn't open a kitchen cabinet without seeing something she'd arranged, couldn't walk into the backyard without the garden she'd kept talking back to me, couldn't sit in the living room in the evenings without the specific quality of quiet in that room being the exact shape of her absence. I wasn't avoiding my grief by thinking about leaving. I was trying to find a way to carry it somewhere. It had room to be just grief, not grief plus the accumulated architecture of everything that grief had displaced. I told Ellen I was going to take a trip, 3 weeks. I wanted to go to the Philippines and see with my own eyes what I'd been reading about, because I was a person who needed to stand in a place and feel it before I could make an honest decision about it. Ellen's response was what I expected, measured, worried in the specific, practical way she worries. A series of questions about safety and healthcare access, and whether I'd have reliable phone service, and whether Gary, this man she'd never met, was someone I actually trusted, or just someone on the internet who seemed credible. I told her he was both, and that I'd been evaluating technical credibility professionally for 3 decades, and I was reasonably confident in my own judgment about it. She didn't love this answer. She also recognized, being her mother's daughter, that there was a difference between a concern she had the standing to override and a concern she had the standing only to voice, and this was the latter. I flew out on a Tuesday in October. Houston to Manila, Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Dumaguete, 3 legs, the last one a short turboprop hop over the water in a small plane that held perhaps 30 passengers and descended over the most extraordinarily blue water I had ever seen. The sea below, in a dozen different shades depending on depth. The island's edge, a dense green, right up to the waterline, and the city itself, low and open along the coast. Nothing like what I'd been picturing when I read the word city, because city in Dumaguete means something different than city means anywhere I'd lived before. Gary met me at the airport in a car he'd borrowed from a neighbor, a cheerful, unhurried man in his early 60s who looked considerably better than he had any right to look after 6 years of the grief he'd described, and whatever it had done to him before he got here. He drove me to a small guest house in the center of the city, a place run by a couple whose children were all grown, and who rented out 4 rooms to occasional visitors, and he walked me around the neighborhood for the first evening, stopping everywhere, introducing me to everyone, people at food stalls and a small hardware store, and a corner bakery that smelled like something I couldn't identify, but immediately wanted to eat. Gary seemed to know everyone on a 2-block radius, not superficially, not the polite nods of a man who's learned to get by, but genuinely, by name, with context, asking after specific children and specific situations, in a way that told me he'd been woven into this particular neighborhood over 6 years, the way thread gets woven, slowly and thoroughly. We ate at a place that night, a small open-air restaurant near the water, where Gary ordered for both of us without consulting a menu because he knew exactly what was good, and we sat and talked for 3 hours while the sea breeze came in off the Bohol Strait and the city noise settled around us into something comfortable rather than intrusive. He told me what to pay attention to over the coming weeks, what to look for, not in the promotional sense, not in the way you'd tell a tourist what to see, but in the way you'd tell someone who was considering a serious decision what to actually weigh. Over the following 3 weeks, I paid attention. Dumaguete was, I quickly understood, a city with a personality, and the personality was shaped by the fact that it was home to several universities, which gave it a demographic and an atmosphere that distinguished it from places where retirement itself had become the organizing principle of the community. There were students on bicycles and professors at coffee shops and a boulevard along the seafront that people walked in the evenings. All kinds of people, families and young couples and elderly men playing chess under a pavilion, and vendors selling everything from roasted corn to fresh coconut. And there was a quality to being in that place in the evenings that I kept reaching for a word to describe, and kept coming back to the word alive. Not because Tucson had been dead exactly, but because this was something in a different register entirely. I spent time at a weekly gathering of foreign retirees that Gary had been attending for years, a group that met on Thursday evenings at a restaurant near the boulevard, and which had the comfortable, overlapping energy of a group of people who'd all arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and who'd long since moved past the explanatory phase of things and into just the business of being in each other's company. There was a man from Alberta named Dennis, who'd been there 9 years, a former accountant who now spent his mornings writing a novel he described as probably unpublishable but deeply satisfying, and his afternoons teaching basic numeracy at a community program that had been organized by a local church. There was a woman from California named Sandra, the only woman in regular attendance at the Thursday gathering, a retired nurse who'd moved to Dumaguete with her husband 7 years ago, lost him to a stroke 3 years after the move, and stayed because, as she put it with the directness of someone who'd thought it through carefully, there was nothing in California she needed that wasn't also available right here, and several things right here that weren't available anywhere in California. Sandra talked to me for a long time on that first Thursday, almost as though she'd appointed herself to the task, asking about Loretta, and about Tucson, and about Ellen, and the grandchildren, gathering the full picture before she said anything beyond questions. Then she said, precisely, that the mistake most people make when they think about a move like this is they think about what they'll be leaving, which is always too easy a list to make from inside it, and not enough about what they might become, somewhere the list doesn't exist yet. I told her that was a very English teacher thing to say, and she laughed and told me she'd been in the book club Gary ran on alternating Saturdays for 5 years, and apparently some of it had rubbed off. I met people through Gary the way I imagine all newcomers to a place like this meet people, which is to say, Gary introduced me to someone who introduced me to someone who introduced me to someone else, and within the first 10 days I had a loose network of acquaintances that was already developing into something warmer. I went with Gary to a weekend market in the city, where local farmers brought in vegetables and fruit, and where a woman named Tessie sold a kind of fried rice, cooked with a quantity of garlic, that I was fairly certain constituted a medical dose, and that was also the best rice I had eaten in living memory. Tessie found my enthusiasm gratifying and began, from that Saturday forward, setting aside a container for Gary whenever he came, which came with me attached by default. I rented a small motorcycle for a few days, something I hadn't ridden in 30 years, and went carefully out into the surrounding countryside, the road climbing up into the hills behind the city, the air cooling as I went up, the view back toward the coast becoming more extraordinary the higher I got. I pulled off at a spot where a few other people had stopped, most of them local, a couple of them clearly tourists, and I stood at the edge of a hillside and looked out over a landscape that looked nothing like anything I'd grown up looking at. So green it seemed like a different version of the color entirely, the sea visible in the distance. And I stood there for a long time doing nothing but looking and breathing, which sounds like nothing worth mentioning, and turned out to be one of the most important things I did that whole trip. Ellen called twice a week during those 3 weeks, always at a time she'd calculated based on the time difference, always with a list of questions she'd clearly prepared, and I answered all of them honestly. I told her the food was extraordinary and the people were genuinely warm in a way that hadn't felt performative, even once so far. I told her the streets were navigable, and the city was nothing like the loud, chaotic experience she'd perhaps been bracing for, based on whatever images she'd gathered from other places in Asia. I told her Gary's community was real and functional, and that Sandra had pushed back on my thinking in ways I found useful rather than discouraging. Ellen listened to all of this with the careful, analytical attention that is also very much her personality, asking follow-up questions that told me she was actually processing the information, rather than just waiting for me to finish talking so she could reiterate her concerns. On my second-to-last evening, Gary drove me to a point on the coast a few miles south of the city, where the road ran right along the waterline and the sun was going down over the water in a way that would have looked like a stock photograph, if a stock photograph could also carry the smell of the sea and the sound of the waves, and the particular quality of light that turns everything it touches slightly golden and slightly unreal. We stood there for a while without talking, the way two people can sometimes stand in a remarkable place if they know each other well enough not to perform the remarkableness at each other. Then Gary said, without preamble, "So, what are you actually going to do?" I told him I thought I already knew, but I needed a few months to be sure it was the right kind of knowing, and not just the specific knowing that comes from being somewhere beautiful on a good day, with good company and a sea breeze. He said that was the most engineer answer he'd ever heard, and that he respected it completely. I flew home on a Thursday, landed in Tucson on a Friday evening, and stood in my kitchen for a while, jet-lagged and tired, and still carrying that strange disorientation of returning to a place that is home and not home, simultaneously, after a long time away. The house was exactly as I'd left it, exactly. And something about exactly was the wrong word, I realized, standing in that kitchen. Loretta's house didn't change when I was gone. It didn't need to. It was already entirely finished being what it was, and what it was a record of a life we'd made together, precise and complete, and, now that I could see it from outside it briefly, very, very still. I spent the next 4 months getting my actual affairs in order, in a way I was determined to do properly, because I was an engineer, and I didn't believe in making irreversible decisions on enthusiasm and hoping the details sorted themselves out. I worked with a financial advisor to restructure my accounts in a way that made international living genuinely practical rather than theoretically possible. I researched international health insurance with the same systematic attention I'd given everything else, found a plan specifically designed for long-term retirees abroad that covered inpatient care, outpatient care, emergency evacuation, and major procedures, and that was, in terms of both coverage and cost, considerably better than what I'd been paying in Tucson for coverage that was technically comprehensive and practically maddening to actually use. I worked with an attorney on everything that needed proper documentation, the will, the power of attorney arrangements that Ellen and I agreed on together, so that if something happened to me, she had clear legal standing to act, without the bureaucratic nightmare that comes when those things aren't sorted out in advance. I made sure every relevant document existed in both the original and certified copies, that Ellen had copies, that my attorney had copies, and that I had a secure digital version of everything stored somewhere accessible from anywhere. I called Gary more times than I probably needed to during those 4 months, asking specific questions about the practical realities, which bank served foreign residents best, how to set up a local account once I arrived, which neighborhoods in Dumaguete had the most reliable internet, whether the electrical infrastructure was reliable enough that I should invest in a backup power solution for my laptop, whether the guest house I'd stayed in had long-term rental options, or whether I'd be better positioned finding a small apartment right away. Gary answered all of it with the patience of someone who understood that the questions were the due diligence, not the anxiety, and who had enough respect for due diligence not to rush it. I told Ellen everything as it developed. Not all at once, not as a single announcement she'd need to process in real time, but gradually, as the pieces came together, so that by the time I said, "I've bought a one-way ticket," the decision was something she'd watched assemble itself over months, rather than something landing on her without warning. This was deliberate. She'd already had one enormous thing happen without warning in the past 2 years, and I wasn't willing to add to that if I could avoid it. She had concerns, real ones that deserved real answers, and I gave her real answers, not reassurances. She wanted to know what happened if I got seriously ill, not minor sick, but seriously ill, and I walked her through the insurance coverage in specific terms, and the proximity of Dumaguete to Cebu, which had several hospitals of a standard I was prepared to trust for most things, and the evacuation coverage for anything that exceeded that. She wanted to know what happened if I fell or had an accident and needed immediate help, and I told her about the network Gary was already part of, real people, not a theoretical support structure, and I told her that one of the things I'd been paying attention to on my trip was specifically how quickly actual help materialized when it was needed, which was faster and more personal than anything available in the Tucson retirement options she'd bookmarked. She asked, quietly, near the end of one of these conversations, whether I was doing this because I missed Loretta or because I wanted to move forward from missing her, and I told her, as honestly as I could manage, that I wasn't sure those were different things. That moving forward doesn't mean moving away from, that I was going to miss Loretta in Dumaguete, the same as I missed her in Tucson, and the difference was that in Dumaguete, the missing would have somewhere to exist alongside a life, rather than in the center of one. Ellen drove up from Phoenix the weekend before I left, and we went through the house together, the way parents and children sometimes do when the life in a house is being formally divided and redistributed. We went through Loretta's books together, the ones I was keeping and the ones Ellen wanted, and the ones we agreed would go to the university library, where Loretta had sometimes guest lectured, and where her absence was already felt by people who'd known her work. We went through the kitchen, which was its own particular project, every cabinet its own specific inventory of 43 years of accumulating the small objects of a shared life, the wedding china that had been Patricia's mother's, the cast-iron skillet Loretta had owned before she met me and refused to give up through 3 kitchen renovations, the coffee mugs in the back of the cabinet that still had the logos of places we'd been on trips, a mug from a state park in New Mexico, a mug from a ferry somewhere in Washington, a mug from a small museum in Santa Fe that we'd driven to on our 30th anniversary because Loretta had read about an exhibit she wanted to see, and we'd turned it into 3 days because 3 days was better than 1. I kept those mugs, all of them. They're in my apartment in Dumaguete right now, on the shelf above the kitchen counter, and I use whichever one I reach for first each morning. And some mornings the New Mexico one comes to hand, and some mornings it's the Ferry one, and occasionally it's the Santa Fe one. And every single morning, whichever one it is, there is a second where I remember where we got it, and I let myself sit inside that for a moment before I pour the coffee and get on with things. Ellen slept in the guest room that last night, the way she used to sleep in the guest room when she drove up from Phoenix to visit when Loretta was still alive. And we ate dinner together at the kitchen table, just the two of us. And we talked about Loretta the way we'd been talking about her in those late, honest conversations that grief sometimes opens up between people who had previously found it easier to talk around the grief rather than into it. Ellen told me things she remembered about her mother that I hadn't known, small, specific things, the kind of things a daughter knows about a mother that a husband doesn't, and I told her things back, and by the time we'd cleared the table the house felt, briefly, different, fuller rather than emptier, as though filling a room with honest memory of a person is one of the few ways a space can briefly feel less like absence. In the morning, Ellen helped me carry the 2 suitcases to the car. I'd thought I would feel worse about this than I did, and I want to be honest about that, because I think the story of leaving a house isn't always the devastating rupture people expect it to be. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes you've already done the hard grief work on the house, already walked through every room and sat with what it held, and let yourself feel the fullness of it, and by the time you're actually leaving, you've already left in the ways that mattered most. I stood at the front door for a moment and I said something to the house, the same way you say something to a place when you know you're not coming back. A private thing, I said quietly, before I pulled the door closed, and then I locked it and handed the spare key to Ellen, and that was that. I landed in Cebu 22 hours later, Manila in between, the long Pacific crossing that crosses the date line and deposits you in tomorrow, which had struck me as oddly appropriate for this specific trip. Gary met me in Dumaguete, the same borrowed car, the same unhurried pace, and drove me to a small apartment he'd helped me arrange remotely over the previous months, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building 6 blocks from the boulevard, with a narrow balcony that looked out over a courtyard where a mango tree grew close enough that the branches touched the railing on mornings after rain. The rent was 8,000 pesos a month. At the exchange rate at the time, that was just under $150. I stood on that balcony after Gary had gone, and I unpacked enough to find the mugs and put them on the kitchen shelf and make myself coffee in the Santa Fe one. And I stood there, looking out at the mango tree and the courtyard below, where a cat was conducting some important investigation in the far corner, and I thought, without any particular drama attached to it, that this was either the best or the worst decision I had made, since Loretta had agreed to move to Tucson 30 years ago, and that I was not going to know which for a while, and that not knowing for a while was fine, because I had become, over the past 2 years, someone who understood that you could survive not knowing for a while. The first weeks were exactly as disorienting as they had been on my research trip, except now the disorientation was permanent rather than temporary, which sounds worse, but turns out to be different in a way that matters. On the trip, every unfamiliar thing had the backdrop of an eventual return to familiar things. Living there, every unfamiliar thing was just the actual texture of life now, and something about that shifted my relationship to the unfamiliarity itself. I stopped experiencing the confusion of the market, of the language, of the particular logic of which shops were open, when and why, as inconvenience, and started experiencing it as simply the process of learning a new place, which is a process I had always, before grief had narrowed me, genuinely enjoyed. There's a street market 2 blocks from my apartment that runs every other Saturday, local vendors with vegetables and fish and prepared food, and an enormous variety of things I had no immediate name for, and I made a point of going every time it ran, and buying something I hadn't tried yet, and going home, and figuring out what to do with it, which resulted in some genuine culinary discoveries, and at least 2 experiments I would not repeat, but which were educational in their own way. One of the vendors, a compact, vigorous woman in her 50s named Perla, took it upon herself, early on, to provide both the vegetable and a rapid explanation of what to do with it, delivered in a mix of English and Cebuano that I caught about 60% of, but that was consistently enough to get me home with a functioning plan. Perla became, over the following months, a reliable source of both produce and unsolicited but generally accurate life advice, including the time she told me, matter-of-factly, that I was buying too much food for one person, and that this was a waste, and I should find someone to share meals with, a suggestion I found both presumptuous and not entirely wrong. I joined Gary's Saturday book club, which met at a coffee shop near the university, and which consisted of Gary, Sandra, a retired Australian economist named Philip, who had opinions about everything, and was right about most of them, a Filipina English professor named Dr. Reyes, who had the quiet authority of someone who'd read more books than everyone else in the room combined, and knew it without needing to say so, and a rotating cast of 2 or 3 others, who came and went, depending on the month. We read in no particular pattern, whatever someone nominated and enough people agreed to, and we talked about the books in the genuinely engaged way that happens when a group of people read something because they want to and not because they're supposed to. And those Saturday mornings became one of the anchors of my week, faster than I'd expected anything to anchor itself. About 3 months in, Gary mentioned that a local engineering firm that did municipal infrastructure work had been consulting with a university program that prepared students for careers in civil engineering, and that the program had been looking, without much success, for someone with field experience who could come in periodically and talk to students about the actual practice of the profession, rather than just the academic theory of it. Gary had apparently told someone at the university about me in one of the way he tells everyone about everyone, the casual, generous information sharing of someone who has decided his job in life is to make useful connections, and within a week I had a meeting with the department head, a serious, precise man named Dr. Aquino, who turned out to have done his graduate work in California, and who asked me technical questions in the first 20 minutes that told me he was screening rather than interviewing, and that the screening was genuine. I told him about the specific projects I'd worked on in Tucson, the water system upgrades, the flood management infrastructure, a particularly complex drainage project near a low-lying neighborhood that had been flooding seasonally for 30 years before we figured out the actual problem and solved it. He asked follow-up questions that were exactly the right follow-up questions, and 2 hours later, I left his office, having agreed to come in twice a month to talk with his senior students about applied practice. I went for the first time the following week and stood in front of 38 engineering students, most of them in their early 20s, looking at me with the attentive, slightly skeptical look that students give a visiting speaker before they've decided whether the speaker is worth their attention. And I talked for 90 minutes about the gap between the theory and the field, the things that go wrong on actual projects, for reasons that no classroom can fully prepare you for, the human and bureaucratic and geological surprises that a career in infrastructure work will eventually serve up, no matter how carefully you plan. I took questions for another 40 minutes, and the questions were sharp and specific, and occasionally caught me needing to actually think before answering, which was the best sign possible. Afterward, a student named Nico waited until the others had filed out, and then asked me, carefully, whether I would be willing to look at the preliminary plans for a drainage project his student team was proposing for a low-income neighborhood on the edge of the city that had been dealing with chronic flooding. He unrolled the plans on the desk without being asked and pointed to the part he thought was wrong, which was in fact the part that was wrong, and explained why he thought so, which was very close to the right explanation. I sat down with him for another hour going through the plans in detail, and by the end of it, Nico's team had a list of specific revisions to work on before their next presentation, and I had something I hadn't expected to have again so soon, the particular satisfaction of a technical conversation where the other person is actually thinking. Nico became, in the months that followed, something that I can only describe as a project, in the best sense. He was brilliant in the specific, unpolished way that brilliant young engineers are. Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know these stories ask more of your time than most of what's out there, but I hope it was worth it, and I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the length of this video does. If you want more stories like this one, told the same honest way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from, and I think if this one landed, you'll want to hear where the rest of them go too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.